So from January 2011, Sarah Staniforth has been Museums and Collections Director at the National Trust. She's also a Director of National Trust Enterprises and Historic House Hotels, which sounds very interesting. I'd like to hear more about that. She was Historic Properties Director from 2005 to 2010 and Head Conservator from 2002 to 2004. She joined the National Trust in 1985 as Advisor on Paintings Conservation and Environmental Control. And she read chemistry at Oxford University, studied paintings conservation at the Courtauld Institute of Art, and worked in the scientific department of the National Gallery from 1980 to 1985. And for those of you who don't know, Sarah also worked very closely with Gary Thompson, I'd be correct in saying that, in coming up with the museum environment, which is not in here, which I think it should be. So that was also a very critical role then. For many years, Sarah served on the council of IIC, initially as a council member, then as vice president, and she was elected president in January 2013. She is currently a member of the Westminster Abbey Fabric Commission, the Gloucester Diocesan Advisory Committee, a trustee of the Hunterian Museum at the Royal College of Surgeons and the Pilgrim Trust, and a member of the Council of the Association of Independent Museums. And you've managed to come over here to present a keynote presentation. And when we were talking to Sarah about what the topic of her presentation would be, it would be like, well, I'm just going to sort that out when I'm in Venice or, you know, with this National Trust tour, or then I'm astonished how you find time just to enjoy yourself, really. She served on the Council of the UK Museums Association from 2005 to 2011. She was a member of the, I'm only halfway through, by the way. She was a member of the Directory Board of ICCM from 1996 to 1999, and she was a member of the UKIC Executive Committee from 1985 to 1989, and chair of the UKIC Professional Accreditation as Conservator Restorer Committee from 2002 to 2005. She is a Fellow of IIC, the Society of Antiquaries, and how do you actually say that? Antiquaries. What a bizarre word. Antiquaries. And the Royal Society of Arts. Excuse me. She chaired the steering group that developed the UK National Heritage Science Strategy from 2008 and 2010, and is currently chairing the board of the UK National Heritage Science Forum. Sarah's presentation today is called Are All Objects Equal? Sarah, welcome.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm embarrassed by that biography, because had I not been flying around the world on National Trust business, I would have shortened it considerably. But it is an absolutely huge pleasure to be here. I mean, several of you I know well, probably, as Andrew said. I've known Andrew for the longest. And one thing he didn't say that we touched on last night, which I think is, you may have realized from my CV, one of the things that I firmly believe in is that we need more conservators working more widely in the heritage and museums sector. So, if you like, you know, moving on from pure conservation jobs into, you know, other sort of directors' jobs. And I mean, not necessarily working for hotels, as I now am a director of the 3 National Trust hotels. But actually, I think that the influence of the conservation profession at a senior management level in museums and heritage organisations is and will be extremely beneficial, because then it'll stop some of the standoffs that I think, you know, do sometimes occur as professions rub up against each other, because, you know, being a director of a museum is something that should be open to all professionals who work in museums. So I would encourage all of you to just sort of think about the wider profession. That was not what I came here to talk about, but it is one of the things that Andrew and I touched on yesterday evening. And you know, as one gets to the sunset of one's sort of working life, you sort of realise, not of course that I'm there yet, but one realises that there is more contribution that one can make. But that's not what I came here to talk about. I've come to talk about are all objects equal? And I've had debates, mainly by email, with Andrew and with Kay and with Kristin and with Julian about what topic that I should tackle. And there is just a little bit of overlap with what Julian is going to talk about later this morning, because you'll see as I go through my presentation what the connections are. But I really wanted to pick up on the theme that I started when I last spoke at a conference in Australia, and that was the IIC Melbourne conference in 2000 when I gave the Forbes Prize lecture. And at that conference, my subject was conservation's significance, relevance, and sustainability. And in this lecture, I said, and I'm going to quote myself here, I think that conservators need to have a very clear idea of the significance of an object before planning its conservation. We must accept that the significance of an object may change with time, depending on historical events and cultural attitudes. This sounds difficult, particularly if we are saying that what is regarded as significant now may not be so in 50 years' time. The pragmatic way of dealing with this has been to exercise the precautionary principle by undertaking minimum intervention, making treatments reversible, and trying to preserve everything. For who knows what will be regarded as significant in the future. However, this is not a realistic position, as we do not have enough resources and must be selective. We have not explored this avenue of thought sufficiently in the conservation of historic and artistic works, and we should consider whether we can adopt a charter, such as the Borough Charter, to guide our work. Of course, in 2000, the Borough Charter was only a year old. I think it's one of its first publications. If so, this charter should be designed to provide clear policy, principles, standards, and guidelines for the profession. So I would like to use the opportunity of returning to Australia, after all the home of the Borough Charter, to pick up this topic and to reflect on how another 13 years of working for an organisation that is responsible for the conservation of natural and cultural heritage has informed my thinking about the relative significance of objects. Thank you for the water. And there is a second way in which objects are not equal, and that is in their robustness or fragility. In an ideal world, no one can argue against providing excellent conditions for the care of all objects, but some objects do not need it. In order for museums and heritage organisations to be sustainable, hard decisions have to be made about what is affordable, both financially and ecologically. Conservators can help by identifying relative fragility. So my talk is in two halves. The first half on significance, the second half on fragility. So I just want to show you some of the places where I work. I'm very keen on beaches. And I'm not doing, when I speak to National Trust audiences, I do a little sort of quiz at this point and say, does anyone recognise this beach? Has anyone been on this beach? Does anyone recognise this beach? It's Wales. It's South Wales, the Gower Peninsula, Rhossili Beach. And this is one of my favourite views of all for National Trust properties. It's to make the point that the reason I went and worked for the National Trust was the National Gallery was fantastic. It was absolutely brilliant working with Gary Thompson and learning so much. I mean, that has absolutely shaped my career. That sent me off in the preventive conservation direction. However, the National Gallery, 2,500 paintings when I was there, in one place, with oodles of staff. I mean, it wasn't really hard. And to be honest, I didn't feel I made a difference. The thing that attracted me about the National Trust is paintings were in the context of whole collections in the historic houses for which they were collected, surrounded by the gardens, which were in turn surrounded by the parks, very often designed landscapes, and in a wider countryside, much of which was also owned by the National Trust. So I've always worked alongside people who are experts in other types of conservation. So you can't just say, you know, I'm a conservator at the National Trust, because we have conservators who work on nature conservation and woodland and archaeological sites. We always have to qualify it by collections conservation for, you know, my particular specialism. So other places, anyone recognise this? Stourhead, 18th century designed landscape in Wiltshire. It will be absolutely stunning at the moment, because we had an incredibly cold winter last year, which went on really late, and then we've had a really hot summer. So the predictions about autumn colours this year are really phenomenal. I think today, what's today? Is it Wednesday today? Yes, Wednesday. Alan Power, who's our head gardener at Stourhead, who is, you know, he's just one of those people who has the gift of the gab, and he speaks just so movingly about working at Stourhead. So every year he gets on Radio 4, BBC Radio 4, and at the height or at the start of the autumn colours, he waxes lyrical about the meaning of the landscape at Stourhead, and, you know, encourages lots and lots of people to come and visit. And you probably won't recognise this. This is Durham. Durham Park, which is just outside Bath, a William and Mary, very Dutch influence house. And in fact, I think I've got a picture of one of the paintings there, Hoogstraten's view down the corridor, which gives the most incredible illusion when you look into that room and the painting. You're looking through two doors there with the painting at the end of it. So we have over 300 houses that are open to the public, and on our collections management system, which is available online, we now have over 1 million objects registered on it, and some of those, when I say actually, I don't mean objects, I mean records on it, because some of those records could be for a whole dinner service, which might have, you know, 100 pieces in it. So, I mean, it's a large dispersed collection, and dispersed over England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and we have a separate National Trust for Scotland. So that's just a little bit of introduction about the context in which I'm working. And that context of working with other conservation professionals beyond the cultural heritage and museum world has very much influenced my views on significance. So the National Trust has drawn extensively on the Borough Charter, and I saw my dear friend Kate Clark in Sydney on yesterday, Monday, thank you, and Tuesday morning actually, because I stayed with her. And it was Kate who came over to work in England in the early, it must have been, well, during the 1990s, brought the Borough Charter ideas with her, and from that we developed conservation management planning in the UK. She then worked for the HLF, and because conservation management planning was a condition of grants for anyone applying to the HLF, that has had a huge influence in the UK. So I can trace exactly the National Trust conservation principles. A couple more, sorry, I should just say that's our most recent acquisition. That's Stonywell, which is an arts and crafts house, 1898, designed by Sidney Jimpson, our most recent acquisition, and a very nice connection from that house, because the clerk of works there was Detmar Blow, who was also the sort of clerk of works for the conservation of this building, which was the first building ever acquired by the National Trust. It's Alfriston Clergy House in Sussex. So the National Trust was set up in 1895 and constituted by Act of Parliament with the following statement, well, with that statement of purpose, and the Act was passed in 1907. And, you know, we still work to that statement of purpose. You know, our purpose is promoting the preservation, the permanent preservation, for the benefit of the nation of places of historic, of natural beauty and historic interest. But, of course, we have realised that permanent preservation, and all of you know this, is not something that is achievable in practice, and we recognise that actually our job is the careful management of change. But in that management of change, it's about revealing and sharing the significance of places and ensuring that their special qualities are protected, enhanced, enjoyed, and understood by present and future generations. And that's been a real sea change, recognising that permanent preservation, you know, is now managing change. And I think we all know that. We see it most greatly on our coastlines with coastal erosion and bits of the National Trust falling into the sea at ever increasing rates. And I know, you know, you have. We've just had the International National Trust conference in Africa, in Entebbe, and we had a speaker from Canberra who was a planner talking about, you know, the whole issues of flooding and the impact on the coast in you know, in that area of Australia. So our first conservation principle. Is that we will ensure that all decisions are informed by an appropriate level of understanding of the significance and spirit of place of each of our properties and why we and others value them. So the writing of a statement of significance is the first step in writing a conservation management plan, and along with our understanding of what visitors and other communities of interest cherish about our properties, this helps to inform the spirit of place. So we bring together statement of significance and our understanding of what people value about our properties, and out of that comes the spirit of place, which typically is a sort of 150, 200 word encapsulation of what is unique, distinctive, and cherished about a place. That uses the ICCMOS definition of spirit of place. And spirit of place, or genius loci, as it's called by those of you who speak Latin, is the touchstone against which all activities of properties are judged. And our property managers assume the role of guardian of spirit of place. And of course, it's very interesting to think about where that has come from, because when these houses were owned and lived in by the families who previously owned them, they wouldn't have thought about themselves as guardian of spirit of place, but that's exactly what they do. So we take our general managers to Chatsworth, still run by the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire, and the Duke encapsulates the spirit of Chatsworth. And I mean, I tell you, it's really clear what the spirit of Chatsworth. I don't know if anyone's been this year, but they have done a massive restoration on the outside of the building. They have replaced. Some of you have been on the Attingham Summer School, I suspect. Marcel, how long ago? Oh my God, you have seen Chatsworth then. I mean, unbelievable what they have done to the west front and the inner courtyard. The glazing bars on the window are gilded. I mean, it's absolutely spectacular, and you see it in the afternoon and evening light, and the stonework glows, and these gilded glazing bars just reflect the light. And, the spirit of Chatsworth is absolutely, no money spared, bling, actually, the best of everything. And it's absolutely clear what Chatsworth is about, and that goes through the way they do conservation and everything else at Chatsworth. And what we are charging our properties managers, this is one who's a guardian of the spirit of the countryside, what we're charging them to do is to understand what a place is about, and that's the touchstone against which they judge all management decisions. So because this is so embedded through working with my colleagues in what I do, I have no problem in thinking about collections in terms of a hierarchy of values, whether they're artistic, historic, financial, their use, rarity, etc., because this has become second nature to me through the use of conservation management plans. So the idea that all objects have equal importance requires not all objects have equal importance, requires museum professionals to think more like heritage professionals. Yet, I observe that my museum colleagues in the UK, Europe and North America tend to resist such hierarchies when considering the objects in their collections. And I'm going to be very interested to discuss with all of you if the Borough Charter has had more influence on the museum world in Australia. And I know from my conversations that I've already had since landing in Sydney that they have, and I am really impressed with the Significance 2.0 document that it says it all. And I'm taking that back to the UK to see if it can have an influence on our Arts Council, who are now responsible for museums and libraries following the end of our Museums, Libraries and Archives Council. So, having said that, there are some good examples of museums that are beginning to grade their collections in terms of value and significance so that they can make decisions about their future management, including disposal. At a national level, the 1999 Delta Plan for the Preservation of the Cultural Heritage has made the Netherlands a leader in the field of preventive conservation. The plan assessed all the country's collection in terms of their conservation needs and graded them in terms of importance, leading to a practical programme for clearing conservation backlogs. And those of you who know Kirby Talley, an American who worked for the Dutch government back in the 90s, he led on that work. And IIC actually awarded Hedy van Ancona, who was the heritage minister, an honorary fellowship and recognition of the way that she led that work on behalf of the Dutch government. And 4 categories of objects were designed in the Delta Plan, ranging from unique objects through to those that should never have entered collections in the first place. So in the UK, by contrast, there are very clear criteria which were introduced 100 years ago in 1913 with the Ancient Monuments Act for the grading of significant buildings. And we've had a lot of events in the UK this year marking the centenary, including a really terrific BBC series, which if you get it here, and I know you get a load of our BBC4 programmes come over for ABC, it's called Heritage, The Saving of Britain's Past, and I would highly recommend it to you. It's 3 one-hour programmes, and it is a really interesting documentary about the start of the grading of important buildings. So in the UK, approximately 374,000 buildings are listed in 3 grades, from those of exceptional interest, sometimes considered to be internationally important, and those of special interest. So that's grade 1, grade 2 star, and grade 2. The only criteria that are available for the grading of objects are the Waverley criteria, which are used for the granting of an export licence. In a sense, the Waverley criteria define the national treasures of the UK, although they would only ever be graded if they have been bought and someone has tried to export them from the UK. So it's not systematic at all, but there are criteria there, and the 3 criteria cover history, aesthetics, and scholarship. But these only cover the most significant objects. There are no lower grades. And the Arts Council England is currently reviewing the criteria for designated museums, and I am hoping that they may take the opportunity to use this to indicate where most significant objects are located, as well as, because designation is about whole collections. So I am certainly going to be sending them the link to Significance 2.0. After this trip. So other countries have systems for, you couldn't just get that on one, thanks. Other countries have systems for defining national treasures. For example, in Japan, where 20% of the national treasures are structures and the remaining 80% are artifacts. Each national treasure must show outstanding workmanship, a high value for world cultural history, or exceptional value for scholarship. There is no internationally agreed way of evaluating the significance of collections. Although I think that Significance International, another Australian organisation, has thought about this, but I don't think that that has been, brought into by any of the international conservation or museum organisations, as far as I know. You may tell me I'm wrong. So while evaluating the significance of collections would inevitably be problematic to introduce, it may become more of an imperative as museum managers struggle with the demands of managing ever-increasing collections in the context of diminishing resources. So I shall repeat the question I asked in Melbourne in 2000 and ask if the museum world should adopt a charter such as the Borough Charter to guide our work, or should we develop a new charter, and maybe Significance 2.0 is at the basis of that. If so, this charter should be designed to provide clear policy, principles, standards, and guidelines for the profession. So that's what I have to say about significance. I'm now going to talk about fragility. And that's it. In April this year, a book I've been working on since 2008 was published, and it's the Getty Readings in Conservation series, and it's called Historic Perspectives in Preventive Conservation. I've got some flyers about this book if any of you are interested in it. I gather there isn't an Australian distributor for it, but copies are available from the US and its distributor in Chicago. So the research for this book has given me the opportunity to reread much of the literature that covers the development of understanding of the fragility of objects, and in particular the more recent developments in risk-based approaches for preventive conservation. I have been particularly influenced by those authors who have attempted to relate the response and behaviour of objects to the conditions in which they are kept. The research of David Earhart, Charles Timosa, and Miriam Mecklenburg at the Conservation Analytical Laboratory at the Smithsonian Institute summarises the evidence, or indeed the lack of evidence, that supports the development of recommendations for the climate in museums, and shows that objects that were previously thought of as fragile were actually able to withstand considerable fluctuations in temperature and relative humidity. In the late 1980s and 1990s, authors began to write about risk assessment and conservation management, reminding the conservation world of the need to consider a wider range of agents of deterioration beyond temperature, RH, and light. In his 1990 paper for the AICCM triennial meeting in Dresden, Stefan Michalski of the CCI, Canadian Conservation Institute, described 9 agents of deterioration. I'm sure that's extremely familiar paper to all of you. This paper systemized the way in which preventive conservation was thought about in museums and has proved highly influential in encouraging conservators not only to think about the museum environment, but also to take a more holistic view of the causes of deterioration. Robert Waller has written a series of articles refining the application of risk assessment and risk management to preventive conservation. The large collection of natural history specimens at the Canadian Museum of Nature, which I am illustrating with some of the National Trust natural history collections. Marcel, where's this? Sir Vauncey Harper Crew's bedroom in Cork Abbey. Sir Vauncey Harper Crew died in 1927, and he was a really enthusiastic collector of all things natural, from birds' eggs to mineral collections to taxidermy. So these are some of our natural history specimens, as you can see, and this is part of the presentation. This is not the National Trust neglecting. This is absolutely deliberate presentation at Cork Abbey, where our spirit of place is the country house in decline, and everything in the house looks as it looked the day before the National Trust acquired the property. And I cannot tell you how clear that has enabled all our conservation decisions to be. So although it looks chaotic, it is absolutely not chaotic. That is deliberate curatorial presentation. To the placing of all of those heads and things that are on Sir Vauncey Harper Crew's bed. And just a sort of anecdote about his standards of housekeeping. In one of the cupboards in the room, there's a little bit of paper which says, I dusted these shelves in 1924. They will not need dusting again for another 5 years. And of course, he died before they were dusted again. So when we took over in 1985, we had to preserve that dust. I mean, it's quite challenging, keeping up the appearance of an abandoned house. So anyway, back to the more orderly Canadian Museum of Nature, where Waller worked. And it proved a good test for the emerging methodology, which also recognised a hierarchy of value among objects. And Jonathan Ashley Smith, who some of you will know, former head of conservation at the V&A Museum in London, wrote a number of articles and a book on risk assessment in the late 1990s and early 2000s. These writings informed his thinking on the precautionary principle, and he observed that from a conservator's point of view, if the environment is controlled to a level that will protect the most sensitive component of an object or collection, then one can never be wrong. But this may not achieve the best result from the museum manager's point of view, as the control method may be too expensive or restrict the visitor's enjoyment of the object. So 2 case studies, the first of which I'm not going to spend too much time on because Julian is going to be talking about this, and it's about international conditions environmental conditions for international loans. It is, however, proving much more controversial than those of us who started working with museums directors in 2008 anticipated. But I'm going to set some context for why I think we are where we are and show how it relates to the precautionary principle and to the desire to treat all objects as equal. Could you possibly advance it for me? Thank you. Some of you may recognize this illustration. It is the slate quarries in Manod in North Wales, and it's where the National Gallery collection was evacuated to in the Second World War. And this was really the roots of some of the thinking on environmental conditions and relative humidity at the National Gallery. And the National Gallery was bombed in the war, and the repair of the building gave the opportunity for air conditioning to be introduced on its return. In the slate quarries, they used the earliest form of conservation heating, which is the sort of it's humidostatically controlled heating. It's what we use in the National Trust now, because we don't put air conditioning into historic buildings. And just this very gentle heating in the quarries reduced the relative humidity to below the threshold at which mould grows, and it kept the humidity quite constant. So that was the sort of the beginning of the understanding of relationship between humidity and object response. But the ability to move from this sort of air conditioning plant, where it looks more like a ship's boiler and had 3 engineers working 24 hours a day, sort of on 8-hour shifts, to automated systems with the ability to control conditions really precisely, has led to tighter and tighter environmental controls, because it's possible to achieve them. So why wouldn't you achieve them if it's possible? But there can be no doubt that now museums and heritage organisations are responding to the growing impact of climate change and are looking again at the environmental impact of their institutions. Because, of course, that tight control is very energy consuming, both in terms of the initial kit that's needed to introduce it, but also for running it. So most museums are making the buildings that house collections more resilient and better equipped to meet the needs of maintenance and preventive conservation, and they're reducing their environmental footprint. So by looking again at the needs of collections and the buildings that housing them, and creating an appropriate rather than an ideal environment, museum managers are able to initiate a virtuous circle whereby the museum's impact on the wider environment is minimised, which reduces its carbon footprint, which in turn reduces climate change impacts. Specifically, many museums are re-examining the stringent RH specifications developed in the second half of the 20th century. In 2008, a group of UK heads of conservation came together under the umbrella of the UK National Museum Directors Conference and wrote guiding principles for reducing museums' carbon footprint. And, well, you can see what those are, but the one I think that's completely most relevant for what we're talking about this morning is that environmental standards should become more intelligent and better tailored to clearly identified needs. Blanket conditions should no longer apply. Instead, conditions should be determined by the requirements of individual objects or groups of objects and the climate in the part of the world in which the museum is located. At a workshop in the Boston Museum of Fine Art in 2009, these guiding principles were shared with the heads of conservation of many large North American museums. With a few tweaking of words, the principles were accepted. So the directors of the museums where the heads of conservation worked in both the UK and the USA took the principles to the BISO group of museums, museum directors who participate in international loans. And these were agreed as new environmental standards for international loans. And that's where we got to. So most significantly, it meant moving away from the very tight specification of 20 plus or minus 1 degree centigrade and 50 plus or minus 5% RH to the following, that proposed interim guideline. However, this proved controversial among many colleagues in other parts of the world, including a few museums in the UK and North America, as well as Europe. And Julian's going to describe the role that IIC is taking on leading this debate, including surveying current practice and providing a neutral forum in which the issues and evidence can be discussed. And that will be in a session at AICCM in Melbourne next September, and then followed by a session at the IIC Congress in Hong Kong the following week. And I hope that many of you will be at, particularly at the IIC Congress, but I realise that the Melbourne one may be more achievable. So finally, I want to talk about bringing places to life and the use of objects. And I'm just going to tempt you with one of the National Trust Historic House hotels. This is Hartwell House, Hotel and Spa, I must add, in Buckinghamshire. It's only about 30 miles from London, so very easy to get there by train on your next visit to England. And we would love to welcome you to the hotel. But actually, I mean, the reason I use it is there's a historic building which is as close to its original use as you can get for a building that has public access, because you can go and you can dine there and you can sleep in the bedrooms. Admittedly, not the original furniture, because that was all sold back in the early 20th century, but in furniture that has been bought of a suitable design to furnish the house. And, you know, that's probably one of the best examples of a place that's open to the public, that gives you a real flavour of how these houses were used originally. But in the past few years, the National Trust has fundamentally changed the way in which we present our historic places to provide a visitor experience which deepens understanding of how historic houses were used over the centuries. This requires a balance between access and conservation, and difficult decisions on whether to conserve and display or use, or to introduce sacrificial substitutes, or produce replicas, or bring in less significant objects from elsewhere. These decisions have budgetary implications and consequences for routine maintenance and care. The creation of replicas can be as expensive as conserving the real thing, but avoids the risk of damaging irreplaceable objects. Risk assessment is used to identify objects which are sufficiently robust to be used by visitors, and this means that some carpets can be walked on, chairs can be sat on, and pianos played. So this is the library at, it's how the library at Lyme Park used to use. I don't think that the Attingham went to Lyme, hasn't been recently. So that's what it used to look like. You know, the visitors were channeled around the outside of the room behind barrier ropes. And we bought about 2 years ago the Lyme Missal, which is a Caxton missal from 1485. And this was the sort of the catalyst for representing the room. So the actual missal is in a display case, but we have a replica, a facsimile copy that people can sit or stand and look at. We have it digitized so that people can also look at it on a monitor, and there's more information about it. And we have sorted through all the books in that library, and there are half of them which are, you know, they're not unique copies. There are many copies of them in other libraries. And so for half of the library, visitors are able to take books from the bookshelves, sit on the chairs, some of which have been introduced, others were robust enough and have been reupholstered. The whole room has been redecorated. You can see the new reproduction wallpaper that we've got there. And the room is now used much more as it would have originally been used by our visitors. And it's really transformed the visitor experience there. And the very big project that I'm working on at the moment is at Knowle, which is a house in Sevenoaks, just south of London. It started off as a sort of medieval bishop's palace, And what we see now is mainly early 17th century. Really fantastic, fantastic collections. For those of you who've read Orlando by Virginia Woolf, Virginia Woolf was a great friend of Vita Sackville-West, who was heartbroken that she was unable to inherit Noel. Her brother instead inherited, and then Vita left, never went back to Noel, bought Sissinghurst and created that fantastic garden at Sissinghurst. But this is the Reynolds Room at Noel, where we have been doing trials for a new form of conservation heating. What you're looking at there is actually a wrap. That's a photograph, a digital image of the walls and the pictures in the Reynolds Room, because we wanted to test what would happen if we actually stopped the drafts at Noel. It's an incredibly drafty house, and this was just for one season, doing it in front of the public, as we do as much of our conservation work as possible, and printing the digital image of the walls onto a polythene type material that formed a vapor barrier. But that's almost by the way, because the other thing that we wanted to do was to enable the visitors to actually walk into the room, because again, it had a fragile carpet. Visitors were shuffled along by the window behind a barrier rope, looked into the room as a stage set. And that gives, that's a sort of false impression of the room. We felt that part of the significance of the room was actually being able to walk into it, but the visitors, the carpet was so fragile, it wasn't right for the visitors to walk on it. So instead, that's an iMat, which is a digital image of the carpet printed onto material, which is it's a bit like a mouse mat. And we're using them all over the place. And I would say that 90% of our visitors have no idea that they are not the real thing. And the other advantage of this is there's no heating at Noel, never has been. It was all open fires. They never put in a hot water circulating system, no radiators. We have been able to put an electric heating mat underneath the iMat so that the conservation heating comes from under the iMat, completely invisible. And of course, as you know, underfloor heating is much more efficient than radiators. So, actual total sort of wins all round in using that iMat as a replica. We have, of course, we're not leaving the plastic wrap around the walls. We're instead doing draft proofing, within the structure, so that'll all be hidden. And just one final example, because I must stop as we're nearly at 10 o'clock. And I'm sure that have you had Downton? You must have had Downton. You've had Downton. Okay. Well, we've got our own Downton. So that's the version you'll be familiar with. Please, when you next come to England, visit Ickworth, 18th century house near Bury St Edmunds, where we have done a big project in the basement called Servants' Lives, where we have our own staff. These are all volunteers, and I want you to really notice that they are age-appropriate volunteers, because the number of places you go to and you find the kitchen maid is a sort of 85-year-old volunteer, completely wrong. So we've got volunteers of all ages, which is absolutely fantastic, because it's really great to get young people involved in the houses, and this sort of live interpretation is really good. And they do it as it's called ghosting. So they ignore the visitors, and we have volunteers who actually do the interpretation. So they're almost like actors in the basement rooms. And everything that they're working with is introduced. It's all replicas. So there are no restrictions on what anyone can touch or sit on in the basement, and then it's interpreted by our volunteers. So to measure the impact of this new approach, we use an exit survey in which visitors are asked to rank their visit on a scale of 5, from not enjoyable to very enjoyable. And answers to a number of other questions enable us to understand how visitors also register a greater engagement with an emotional response to the history of the place and the people who lived and worked there. This data collected demonstrates that the pleasure visitors derive from the use of collections enhances their appreciation of historic places. This creates another virtuous circle in which visitor numbers increase, which increases the financial bottom line, which creates more funds for conservation work and measures that improve visitor enjoyment still further. So in adopting this approach, we've made some difficult decisions about which objects can be used, and we have also moved away from the precautionary principle. We believe that this change will result in a goal worth achieving because it helps museums and heritage organisations to become more sustainable. And just some final figures to look at our membership numbers. So we're not government. We have no public funding at all. We are a self-sustaining charity. And a third of our income comes from membership. And at the moment, our membership is just over 4 million, and our target is 5 million members by 2020. And actually, just as a rule of thumb, every million members translates to 5 million visitors at our pay-for-entry properties. So we're now at 20 million visitors across the 300 sites. We are expecting to be at 25 million by 2020. That has its own issues. I'm not talking about that today, but in terms of conservation and access, we're on top of that one as well. So my conclusion is that it will be clear that I do not think that all objects are equal, and I realise that the message in this paper may not be a comfortable one. I think it's probably more comfortable here than it is back home. I'm convinced that the museum world needs to move away from the safe ground of treating all objects as equal to a less comfortable place where the relative significance and fragility of objects are considered before any decisions about their management are taken. Debate will need to take place about the mechanisms that the conservation profession needs to put in place to achieve this. I hope that it will not be another 13 years before we succeed. Thank you very much.